On June 9, 2026, a jury sentenced a 19-year-old to 35 years in prison. His mother called it mercy. Austin Metcalf's mother called it a lifetime, and the crowd outside that courthouse had called it something else entirely. Who was right? Because here is the thing nobody is talking about. That courtroom yesterday was not just deciding the fate of one teenager. It was deciding something much bigger than that. Something this entire country has been arguing about since the moment this story broke. And by the time this video is over, you are going to have your own answer to that question. Stay with me, because this story is not what you think it is. Before we go any further, this video covers a real and very recent court case involving the loss of a young life. The details are emotional and deeply unsettling. Please watch with that in mind. If you are new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now. We cover stories that matter. Stories that make you think. Stories that refuse to be simple. And before we go one sec further, drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to know where in the world you are watching this from. I read every single one. All right, let us get into it. To understand what happened in that courtroom yesterday, you have to go back. All the way back to where this started. Not to the trial, not to the arrest, not even to the moment everything went wrong. You have to go back to who these two young men were before any of this happened. Because this is the detail that gets lost in every headline, every trending post, every hot take, every argument in every comment section. These were not criminals. These were not troubled kids with histories of violence. These were not cautionary tales waiting to happen. These were two teenagers doing exactly what teenagers are supposed to do. Karmelo Anthony, 17 years old at the time, 19 by the time he sat in that courtroom. A student athlete, a young man carrying a 3.8 GPA, no criminal record, no juvenile history. Not a single prior encounter with law enforcement. Not one. By every measurable standard, a young man with a future. Austin Metcalf, also 17 years old, also a student athlete, also a young man with everything stretched out ahead of him. A twin, someone's son, someone's brother, someone's teammate. Also, by every measurable standard, a young man with a future. Two young men, same age, same kind of promise. Both standing on the edge of everything their lives were about to become. And on April 2nd, 2025, they ended up at the same track meet. On the same afternoon, at Courthouse Stadium in Frisco, Texas. And what happened between them in the next few minutes is what brought an entire nation to a standstill yesterday. But here is what I need you to hold on to before we go any further. The story you think you know is probably not the complete story. Both sides of this case told two very different versions of the same afternoon, and 12 strangers had to sit in a room and decide which version was the truth. Which version would you have believed? Hold that question. We are coming back to it. April 2nd, 2025. A Wednesday, a district-wide track meet. Multiple schools competing at Courthouse Stadium in Frisco, a suburb just outside Dallas, Texas. Students running, coaches coaching, families watching, everything exactly as it should be. And then, in a matter of moments, everything changed. Here is what happened. Karmelo Anthony had been sitting under the tent belonging to Memorial High School, a rival school, Austin Metcalf's school. Members of the Memorial track team, including Austin Metcalf, repeatedly told Karmelo Anthony to leave. Words were exchanged, tensions escalated, and then the confrontation became physical. Austin Metcalf put his hands on Karmelo Anthony. What happened in the next fraction of a second is what this entire trial was built around. Karmelo Anthony pulled out a knife. Austin Metcalf was stabbed. He was rushed to the hospital. He did not survive. Austin Metcalf died that day, 17 years old, in the arms of his twin brother Hunter, at a track meet, on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. Now here is where this case becomes genuinely and profoundly complicated. Because the question was never really about what happened. Both sides agreed on the basic sequence of events. The only question that truly mattered, was this. Was what Karmelo Anthony did a justified act of self-defense, or was it, by the letter of the law, murder? And that question split this country down the middle. It split legal experts. It split communities. It split families sitting at dinner tables across America. And right now, before you hear another single detail, I want to split you too. What does your gut tell you? Self-defense or murder? Drop it in the comments right now, because I want to see where you stand before you hear everything else. In the immediate aftermath, law enforcement responded. Karmelo Anthony was taken into custody, and the charge filed against him was not manslaughter. It was not a lesser charge. It was first-degree murder. And the moment that charge hit the news, this case became about something much larger than one afternoon at a track meet. It became about race. It became about the justice system. It became about whether a young black teenager could walk into an American courtroom and walk out with a fair result. Because here is the detail that poured gasoline on an already burning conversation. Karmelo Anthony is black. Austin Metcalf was white. And from the moment that detail entered the public conversation, people stopped seeing two teenagers. They started seeing everything else. Every prior verdict that felt wrong. Every case that ended in a way that did not feel like justice. Every fear. Every frustration. Every unresolved wound. This case became a container for all of it. Now I want to be honest with you here, because this is where coverage of this story consistently gets it wrong. The lawyers on both sides stood in front of that jury and said clearly, this tragedy had nothing to do with race. And I think that needs to be said. The legal case was not about race, but the public conversation absolutely was. And pretending otherwise does not serve anyone. What I am going to give you today is both sides, every argument, every moment, every question. And then I am going to let you decide. Because here is the truth that both sides of this story share. Austin Metcalf's family deserves justice, and Karmelo Anthony's family deserves fairness. And in a perfect world, those two things would never be in conflict. But in this case, they were. Stick with me. Because what happened inside that courthouse was unlike anything most people expected. The courthouse was packed from the very first day. Not just with families and attorneys and journalists. People lined up outside that building every single morning. Some never made it through the doors, but they came anyway, because this case had reached inside them personally. Before the trial even began, before a single witness took the stand, supporters of Karmelo Anthony gathered outside and chanted, "We declare, we decree, Karmelo Anthony will walk free." That was the atmosphere surrounding this trial. That was the temperature of the crowd. That was the weight that 12 jurors carried into that courtroom every single morning. On one side, Austin Metcalf's family, grieving, determined, carrying a loss so heavy it had physically changed them. His mother, his father, Jeff, and for the very first time appearing in that courtroom, his twin brother, the same brother who was there when Austin took his last breath, who had spent over a year waiting for this moment. On the other side, Karmelo Anthony's family, frightened, hopeful, watching their son sit at a defense table, facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life behind bars. Think about what that feels like, not abstractly. Actually think about it. 19 years old, sitting in a courtroom, facing 5 years to 99 years in prison. That is every single year of the rest of your life sitting on one side of a scale. And on the other side of that scale, a young man who went to a track meet and never came home. A twin brother building a life in a world his brother no longer exists in. There is no version of this story where everybody walks away whole. There never was. Now, jury selection became its own controversy. 3 individuals who identified as African American did not make it onto the final jury. Many in the community felt that was deliberate. Others argued the process was legally sound. The judge, aware of exactly how charged this case was, worked carefully to protect those 12 jurors. There had been threats against people connected to this case, on both sides, and the judge wanted to make absolutely sure that the people deciding this verdict could do so without fear. The final jury included Asian American jurors, women, a Muslim woman. It was not, despite what circulated online, an all-white jury. But the perception in the community had already been set, and in a case this loaded, perception carries its own kind of weight. Comment 1 if you think the jury was fair. Comment 2 if you think it was not. I want to see the split in real time. The prosecution called 21 witnesses, 21 people who took that stand and told that jury what they saw on April 2nd, 2025. Many of them broke down in tears. Some could barely finish their sentences. The testimony went on for days, and then the defense presented its case. Here is how the two sides framed those few seconds at the track meet. Prosecutor Bill Worski was direct and unsparing. He told that jury, deadly force has to be immediately necessary to be legal. A shove, however aggressive, does not meet that threshold. The force Karmelo Anthony used was excessive, and under Texas law, excessive force in response to a non-lethal act is not self-defense. It is murder. And then he said it plainly. Plain and simple murder. Defense attorney Mike Howard told a completely different story. He stood before that jury and said, Austin Metcalf had no legal right to put his hands on Karmelo Anthony. Texas law does not require that you wait until you get hit. Karmelo Anthony was 17 years old. He was outnumbered. He was on unfamiliar ground. He was confronted and pressured and physically touched. And in that moment, in that single terrifying fraction of a second, he did what he believed he had to do to survive. Both of those arguments are logical. Both of those arguments are human. And that is precisely what made this case so extraordinarily difficult to sit with. The turning point, the moment legal observers believe shifted the entire weight of this trial, was one word: proportionate. Under Texas law, the force you use in self-defense must be proportionate to the threat you face, and it must be immediately necessary. The prosecution hammered those words again and again and again. Was pulling a knife immediately necessary in response to a shove? That was the question the jury carried into deliberations. And here is what happened next. They came back in under 3 hours. In a first-degree murder trial. Under 3 hours. That is not a jury that struggled. That is not a jury that went back and forth. That is a jury that walked into that room already knowing where they were going. If you have made it this far, you are exactly the viewer this channel exists for. Hit that like button right now. It costs you nothing, and it helps this story find the people who need to hear it. The jury filed back in. Judge John Roach Jr. was on the bench. He had already warned every single person in that courtroom. No outbursts. Anyone who reacted would be held in contempt. Two families, sitting feet apart from each other, waiting for the same word. Desperate for completely opposite outcomes. Austin Metcalf's twin brother Hunter was in that courtroom for the first time, leaning forward in his seat. Karmelo Anthony sat at the defense table, 19 years old, waiting, and then the verdict was read. Guilty. Guilty of first-degree murder. The jury had the option of manslaughter, a lesser charge, a softer landing. They did not take it. They went straight to murder. Karmelo Anthony's mother broke down. His father sat completely still. Hunter Metcalf leaned forward. And outside, the moment those phone alerts went through the crowd, some people wept. Some people embraced. Some people stood completely still, staring at their screens as if reading it one more time would change the words. Some groaned. Some felt relief. Some felt rage. And some people felt all of those things at the exact same moment, because this case had never been simple enough for just one emotion. Has your answer changed? Go back to your first comment. Tell me if anything shifted, but the verdict was not the end. Within minutes of that guilty verdict being read, the punishment phase began. The same 12 people who just said guilty now had to answer one more question. How many years? 5 or 99? Everything between those two numbers was on the table. But first, there was one more legal question standing between Karmelo Anthony and his sentence: sudden passion. Under Texas law, if the jury found that Karmelo Anthony acted under sudden passion, overwhelmed by emotion, acting, before he had time to calm down, the maximum sentence would drop dramatically, down to 20 years. That was the defense's final argument, their last lifeline: sudden passion. The prosecution responded with 6 words that silenced that entire courtroom. Prosecutor Bill Worski looked at that jury and said, "Mercy to the guilty is cruelty to the innocent." 6 words, and every single person in that room felt them land. The punishment phase called one witness, just one, Karmelo Anthony's mother. She walked to that stand, in a courtroom that had just called her son a murderer, and she spoke directly to the jury. She told them her son was sorry. She told them who he was before April 2nd, 2025. She described the son she raised, the young man behind the verdict. And then she asked those 12 strangers, with everything she had, for mercy. Karmelo Anthony sat at the defense table as his mother spoke, and he wept. There is no camera footage of that moment. No photograph, no recording. Just the account of everyone who was in that room. A 19-year-old. Listening to his mother beg strangers for his future. Then the victim impact statements began. Austin Metcalf's aunt was the first to speak. She stood before that courtroom and said, April 2nd, 2025 is a day she will never forget. Then Austin's father, Jeff Metcalf, spoke. Freed for the first time from the restrictions of the trial gag order, he spoke publicly about what his family had endured beyond the walls of that courthouse. He defended his son's memory against the wave of online backlash that had painted Austin in an unfair and deeply painful light, and he revealed something that had not been widely reported. His family had been targeted by multiple swatting calls, deliberate, dangerous, terrifying. People calling emergency services to send armed responders to their home. A family already drowning in grief, being targeted while simply trying to survive the loss of their child. Jeff Metcalf stood in front of that courthouse, and he made one thing absolutely clear. This was not about race. This was not about politics. This was about right and wrong. His son went to a track meet, and he did not come home. That is the only story he wanted the world to remember. And then Austin's mother spoke, and she said something that stopped every single person in that courtroom cold. She looked at the jury. She looked at the room, and she said, Karmelo Anthony received 35 years, but she was sentenced to a lifetime without her son. 35 years versus a lifetime. That is the mathematics of grief. And no sentencing chart in the world can calculate what that actually means. The jury went back to deliberate the sentence. 2 hours and 20 minutes. And when they returned, they delivered two decisions. Decision 1, sudden passion rejected. Karmelo Anthony would not receive the reduced sentence. The jury looked at those final arguments and decided that what happened at that track meet did not qualify. Decision 2, 35 years. Karmelo Anthony, 19 years old, sentenced to 35 years in prison. He will not be eligible for parole until he has served at least 17 and a half years. He will be in his mid-30s at the absolute earliest, before all parole is even a possibility. A new mugshot was taken. Karmelo Anthony in the Collin County Jail, his first night of a 35-year sentence. Now let me tell you what was happening outside that courthouse, while all of this unfolded inside, because cameras were not allowed in that courtroom. But the world was watching from the steps outside. When the guilty verdict came through, the crowd outside erupted. People had been there all day. Some had been there every single day since jury selection began. Supporters of Karmelo Anthony, supporters of Austin Metcalf's family, and people who had never tried to get into that courtroom, who were simply there because this case had reached into something they had been carrying. Long before April 2nd, 2025, the Collin County Sheriff's Department was present in full force, managing the crowd, stepping between people when tensions flared, making sure the emotion in that crowd never crossed a line, and by most accounts, they handled it. But the tension never fully left, because tension like that does not dissolve when a judge bangs a gavel. It lives in people. It travels home with them. It sits at their tables. It follows them into the next morning. When the sentence came through, when 35 years hit those phone screens, the reactions split again. Some people felt it was too much, that a teenager, however wrong his actions, should not lose decades of his young life behind bars. Some people felt it was not enough, that Austin Metcalf lost everything, every year, every moment, every possibility. And 35 years with parole eligibility at 17 and a half did not feel proportionate to the permanence of what that family lost. And some people simply stood there, quietly, because sometimes a situation is too heavy for any reaction at all. Outside the adjourned courthouse, Austin Metcalf's family held a press conference. His father, Jeff, stood before the cameras, his mother beside him. Hunter, Austin's twin, standing there too, and they spoke, for the first time without restriction, without a gag order, without legal constraints on their words. They spoke about Austin, about who he was, about what the family had been through, not just inside that courtroom, But outside it too, the swatting calls, the online attacks, the way their son's memory had been distorted by people who never knew him. And Austin's mother, the same woman who had just told a jury that 35 years was nothing compared to a lifetime without her son, stood in front of those cameras and said what every grieving mother says when the verdict is done and the crowds go home and the cameras eventually turn away. She said, "This does not bring him back. Nothing does." I want to take a moment before we close to zoom out, because I think this case deserves more than a summary. Two teenagers, both doing exactly what teenagers are supposed to do. Going to school, playing sports, building the early chapters of their lives, and somewhere in an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, all of that ended, for both of them, in completely different ways, but permanently for both of them. Austin Metcalf will never come home. His brother, Hunter, will carry the shape of that absence every single day for the rest of his life. His mother wakes up every morning, sentenced to a lifetime without her son. His father will defend his memory for as long as he has breath to do it. And Karmelo Anthony, who is 17 years old. When one decision, in one fraction of a second, changed the direction of everything, will spend at least the next 17 and a half years inside a prison. He will walk out, if he walks out, into a world that has moved on without him. There are no winners in this story. There never were. From the very first moment, this was only ever a story about loss. What does this case say about us as a society? What does it say about how we raise young men? What does it say about conflict? What does it say about the space between the law and what feels human? What does it say about race in America? What does it say about justice? What does it say about grief? I do not have all the answers, and I am genuinely suspicious of anyone who says they do, because this case is complicated, and complicated cases deserve complicated conversations, not hot takes, not outrage, not sides, conversations. That is what this channel is for. That is why I made this video, not to tell you what to think, but to give you everything you need to think for yourself. So here is what I want from you. Before you leave, 3 things. Number 1, was 35 years the right sentence? Too much or not enough? Drop your answer in the comments. 1 sentence. That is all I ask. Number 2, share this video with one person who you think needs to hear this story. Not to argue, just to start a conversation. Number 3, subscribe if you are not already here, because we have more stories coming. Stories that matter, stories that challenge you, stories that refuse to be easy. Austin Metcalf deserved a future. Karmelo Anthony deserved a future. Somewhere between those two truths is where the real conversation begins. I will see you in the next one.